Okay, so we just talked in the last video about how to find all of the solutions of a polynomial by using the graphing calculator, pulling off 1, 0, and then using synthetic division. You might be wondering, having watched that video, well, what's the point in learning synthetic and factoring and so on if I can just go to the graphing calculator and get the zeros right from there? And I think that that's a valid question, but the reason why we can't just use the graphing calculator all the time is for two reasons. Number one, you might have solutions that are irrational. And if they're irrational, the calculator is just going to give you that ugly decimal, where we would prefer to get the exact answer. Or we could run into a situation where we have imaginary solutions, and then they're not going to come up on the graph at all. So that's really why we have to learn synthetic. If everything is going to be rational, nice and clean numbers, then yeah, we could probably use the graph calculator a lot. But those are the two reasons: irrational solutions and imaginary solutions. So let's take a look at this one. First thing we're going to do is we're going to use the graphing calculator, try to find one clean zero. Now, we talked about the P over Q list in the last video, so let me just kind of go back over that real quick. If you have to use a P over Q list, you would get, in this case, factors of -6. Remember, we always put plus or minus. Factors of -6 are 1, 2, 3, and 6. Fortunately, Q is just 1, so the only factor of 1 is 1. So I don't have too many options here. So this one probably wouldn't take you quite as long as some other ones. All right, but again, we're going to use the graph this guy. So let's see, we have x cubed minus 5x squared plus 8x minus 6. Okay, now as I take a look at this, notice how I'm getting a clean zero of 3, but that's the only one. That's the only zero that I'm seeing. That means I only have one real zero, which means I have two imaginary. Because remember, I have to have a total of 3 solutions here. So I'm going to have one real at x equals 3, and then 2 imaginary. Okay? So just like we talked about before, I'm going to use synthetic division now. So I have a 3 on the outside. Remember, always look to see if you're missing any terms. In this case, I am not, because I have x cubed, x squared, x, and then a constant, so I'm not missing anything. So I have 1, -5, 8, and -6. Remember, I should get a remainder of 0, so I'm going to put that at the bottom and highlight that. If I don't get 0, that means I'm doing something wrong. Okay, so here we go, synthetic division. Drop down the 1, multiply by 3, gives me 3. Add vertically, -2. Multiply by 3 gives me -6. Add vertically, gives me 2. Multiply by 3 gives me 6. So perfect. All right, so I'm left with x squared minus 2x plus 2 equals 0. Okay, now, these are imaginary solutions because they didn't show up on the graph. Therefore, factoring is kind of out in this case. So I'm down to either completing the square or the quadratic formula. I've never been a big fan of using the quadratic formula, so I'm going to go through and I'm going to use completing the square. But keep in mind, you can use quadratic formula. That's totally up to you. So if I'm going to complete the square, the very first thing I want to do is I want to swing the constant, which in this case is 2. I want to swing that to the other side. That's going to give me -2 on the right. Now, to complete the square, remember, I take half of b, which is the middle term, and I square it. So in this case, half of -2 is -1. -1 squared is +1. But I have to keep my equation balanced, so I have to add 1 on the right side immediately. All right, now I'm going to factor the left. The left-hand side will always factor into x plus b over 2, quantity squared. So in this case, that's going to leave me with x minus 1 squared. because b is negative 2. Negative 2 divided by 2 is negative 1. And I have negative 1 on the right. We use square roots at this point. I'm going to take the square root of both sides. So that leaves me with x minus 1 equals plus or minus I. Square root of negative 1 is I. And then last, add the 1 to both sides. So I get 1 plus or minus I. So again, I use completing this square. If you use quadratic formula, you're going to get to that same answer. I think it takes more steps with quadratic. The simplifying takes a little bit longer, but there we go. Now, I have two solutions here with this one because there's a plus or minus. So 1 plus I, 1 minus I. So when you list them, it doesn't really matter how you list them. You could list them separately or together. I typically just list them together. So my solutions in this case are positive 3 and 1 plus or minus I. So that totals 3, just like I knew that I needed. So again, if I'm getting into irrational and imaginary solutions, I absolutely have to understand how to pull a zero off the graph and do synthetic division. Okay? And then sometimes if you're dealing with rational solutions, you will be able to factor the remaining polynomial. In this case, it was not factorable, so that's why I had to use another technique. Okay? So I hope that helps with that. Good luck on these kind of problems.